Equifax is reporting that consumer debt in Canada has now reached a record yet again of $2.15 trillion. That is an absolutely huge amount, and a lot of it is attributed to mortgage debt. But there's some other things going on in the economy as well, and I'm going to break down the Equifax report for you today and discuss all the things that are happening with respect to debt in the economy and what it could mean for you going forward. But before we get into it, do me that favor, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and please hit that like button so more people like you can see this video. And don't forget about our race to 25,000 subscribers, where one lucky subscriber is going to win $5,000 to maybe pay off their debt or put towards their mortgage or use as a down payment or simply do with what they like. Maybe they'll invest it, who knows? But it's up to the subscriber, and one thing is for certain, you have to be subscribed to win. So go ahead, it's free, it's easy, and it's definitely worth it. The definitive guide on how to manage your credit, product, penalty, price, in that order. It's never been more important to get your mortgage right. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's discuss the report out of Equifax today, the news release out of Equifax today. The consumer debt has hit $2.15 trillion, the highest it has ever been in Canada, which they also reported this a few months ago that it had reached a record, and it's probably going to continue to hit records time after time again. Now, some of you will note there was a previous video done where Stats Canada released some information with respect to non-mortgage debt going down. The numbers here today contradict what Stats Canada said. Haven't had a real big chance to go in and take a look and see why there's such a huge discrepancy. But the one thing that I can consider, and the one thing that I think is probably happening, is that when it comes to monitoring people's debt and knowing how much debt Canadians have, Equifax is probably the number one source of data in Canada for that information, because almost every mortgage, every credit card, everything that you borrow in Canada gets reported to Equifax, so they have clearly the best data on this and probably better data than Stats Canada. So I'd be more inclined to believe the data I'm going to show you today versus what was previously reported in our previous Stats Can video. Obviously, Stats Canada is an amazing organization. They have a lot of amazing data, but it's not always perfect, and I think this is an indication that their last report may have been just that, not perfect. So let's get into it. Let's discuss consumer debt, and we'll start with the headline, which is the $2.15 trillion in consumer debt, the highest it's ever been, new record, so on and so forth. One thing to note though is that this is only up about 3% since the last quarter and is only up 7.5% from Q2 of 2020. Now, even though there was an incredibly large number of new mortgages in the last quarter, the actual debt amount has only gone up since last year by about 7.5%. And that typically means that mortgages are being taken out to replace other mortgages. Debt is being taken out to replace other debt. Yes, those of you who commented in the comment section below saying that HELOCs were a major issue, you're probably more right than what the previous data from Stats Canada showed. Although I do think there are a lot of people paying off their non-credit card debt, their non-mortgage debt, paying off their credit cards in Canada, and there is data from Equifax to support that as well, which I'll show you at the end of the video. But let's take a look here and just look at some of the highlights from this report. First and foremost, there was 410,000 new mortgages in Q2. Now, there's obviously some renewals of mortgages that are being switched to other lenders. There's refinances. There are mortgages being used to purchase properties, but you have to think that is a pretty huge number of new mortgages in Canada in the second quarter. And I think a lot of that has to do with the number of transactions that were happening in the real estate market and the number of people that were just ultimately coming up for renewal, because 2016 was another big year for mortgages. Those people would have been at their 5-year renewal stage, and therefore that increases the volumes as well. So really big spring in the mortgage and lending industry this last spring. Now, that 410,000 new mortgages represents a 60.2% increase over 2020. So obviously in the second quarter of 2020, there wasn't a lot of borrowing going on because obviously we were in lockdown from the pandemic. Huge increases over that quarter last year. This has a similar sort of transitory effect that the inflation numbers have. Obviously, we're seeing huge numbers here because we saw very low numbers previously. That just has to do with the fact that we were locked down last spring, and this is not to be taken as a real legitimate number. I mean, it's a legitimate number from the perspective of that's how much we're up, but from a traditional standpoint, we are not up 60.2% over the traditional number of mortgages that happen in Q2. Now, the average new mortgage in Canada is $335,000. So for those of you who in BC and Ontario who don't believe that this is even possible, what this tells us is that people across Canada are still buying houses for not $1 million and not $2 million. And ultimately, the average new mortgage is significantly lower than what those mortgages being obtained in BC and Ontario are. And that is quite frankly because in Calgary, for example, you can still buy a pretty decent home. A lot of people are buying condos, getting $100,000, $200,000 mortgages. Same thing in other prairie provinces and especially in Eastern Canada. So the average mortgage in Canada is still not ridiculously high, but this is the highest that it has ever been at $355,000. I know some of you are going to watch this and say, hey, he just said that's not high, and that's because, quite frankly, in the markets we're in, the markets that we're dealing in significantly bigger mortgages than this $355K. Well, that's a significant increase over 2020, where the mortgages were 22.2% smaller. There's a 22.2% increase over the average mortgage size in 2020. So obviously mortgages have gone up quite substantially. And this goes to show that in 2020, the average mortgage was probably just under $300,000, which that is that price pressure, that upward price pressure that's happened across the country from West Coast to East Coast. Everyone's included in that. And that is showing in the average mortgage amounts across the country. Now, here's an interesting number for you. BC mortgage volumes were up 85.7%. So while they haven't had the biggest increases in prices, for whatever reason, and I'm not sure why this is, they have had an 85.7% increase in the number of mortgages. Now, this isn't the amount of the mortgages. This is the number of actual transactions that happened, but 85.7%, that is almost 25% more than the rest of the country. The rest of the country is up around 60%. Now, here's the interesting one. HELOC volume is up 57%. And if you go and you take a look at the BNN article covering this, if you go and take a look at the Equifax news release, there's a lot of conversation about HELOCs here and how this could be a problem. But I want to point out that HELOC volume is actually up less than total mortgage volume, which is meaning that there's less people actually taking out HELOCs than there are mortgages. So I don't think this is alarming, but the BNN article and the VP of Equifax seem to think it is. Obviously, a lot of people take out HELOCs, one, for lower payments. They take out HELOC, or because it's interest only, they take out HELOCs just to have them, just in case. I think if you want to consider the number one reason why people would be taking out HELOCs right now, it is likely because they're concerned about the future and having a backup plan should something happen. So, I know if I'm a consumer and we all get put on lockdown and incomes go down, the first thing I'm doing as soon as I get an opportunity, if I don't already have one, is getting a HELOC just in case it happens again. So these numbers being up makes total sense. And I would guess, and I know there's a lot of naysayers out there, but I would guess that this has a lot to do with people just having a safety net and not necessarily a utilization problem where people are actually borrowing the money. And you'll see why I think that when we get to the actual debt numbers that come up a little bit later on. Now, this is a quote from Equifax. This is straight out of their article. The HELOC trend is worrisome as often the payments are tied to a variable interest rate. Now, one thing to consider here is I'm going to say that the large majority of mortgages in the last year that were taken out are variable rate mortgages, 5-year terms, closed terms with a discount, but most of them were variable rates. HELOCs, yes, they have variable rates. If you think interest rates are going to go up, that is something you need to plan for. But again, the Equifax article and the person that was quoted in this article talks a lot about the inflation rates and about how there's this potential impact that is coming as a result of the higher inflation rates and higher interest rates as a result. Points out the 3.7% interest rate. I think it is actually not necessarily accurate for that person to point out that there's obviously going to be interest rate increases, because she doesn't know that. And a lot of the data tells us that that isn't actually going to be the case. Obviously, we're going to see interest rates go up at some point, but if you watch the video that's going to come out tomorrow, we're going to talk about GDP numbers, because those were substantially less than what they thought they were going to be, which provides further pressure for the Bank of Canada to keep interest rates lower longer, and will also have an effect on inflation, bringing the numbers down. So tune in for that one tomorrow. But this is definitely something that you want to be conscious of, is variable rates and the fact that HELOCs are variable rates if you're borrowing from a HELOC. But at the end of the day, most people, I do believe, are borrowing these in order to have a security blanket, not necessarily to borrow money and utilize it. And this is the quote that I was talking about. Prices for consumer goods have risen, and if the inflation trend continues, there's potential for an earlier than planned interest rate increase to curb this. I think it's not only ridiculous, but it's a little bit reckless for Equifax to go out and say, hey, we are predicting an earlier than planned interest rate increase, because I just don't think, especially with the GDP numbers that were released today, that earlier than planned is in the cards. In fact, I think it'll probably be significantly later than planned, but that is just my assessment of it. And my big caveat here is I want to make sure that people aren't making borrowing and buying decisions based on the information that I'm providing, but taking a well-rounded look, looking at your own personal risk factors and making your decisions based on that. Now, on an individual basis, the average consumer debt, excluding mortgages, so this is non-mortgage debt. This is the type of debt that Stats Canada came out last month and said was going down. It is now $20,640, a drop of 1.6%. Now, there is a possibility that Equifax data here is lagging Stats Canada's. I'm not sure why the numbers are so different, because Stats Canada basically said that the average number of non-mortgage debt is now at $16,000 and there's been significant payoff. I'm not sure what the discrepancy here is, but nonetheless, both are saying, at least to some extent, consumer debt is going down right now. Now, quarter over quarter, new credit card volumes has increased by 2.8%, but has yet to reach pre-pandemic levels. Reason I point this out is because this isn't the amount of money that's being borrowed off of credit cards. This is the number of new credit cards that is being opened. And that is not surprising, because in the financial space that I work in, which is finance on YouTube, we have companies all the time that come to us and offer sponsorships. Now, we rarely take them, but they do often come to us with credit card companies that are offering products. And during the middle of 2020, basically until the first quarter of 2021, most of the credit card companies were no longer offering incentives and partnerships, because they were trying to slow down the number of credit cards that they were taking on. Now they have reopened those and they're trying to get new credit card clients. So it is no surprise that this number, the number of new credit cards being opened, is up. And it's also no surprise that it hasn't reached pre-pandemic levels, because I think what everybody learned was that credit cards are a really scary thing, especially if you aren't sure if you're going to have an income going forward. Now, here's another interesting one. The 90-plus day delinquency rates for both mortgage and non-mortgage products continued to decrease this quarter. So delinquency rates are going down. That means people actually have the money to make their payments. And they're down by 32.6% and 28.6% respectively when compared to Q2 2020. Now, obviously, Q2 2020, there was probably going to be a lot of delinquencies, a lot of people losing their jobs, but these numbers getting better is a good sign for the economy. It means people seem to be going back to work and seem to be managing their debt differently than they were pre-pandemic and early during the pandemic. Now, I wanted to show you this chart here. This is one that you can go and find from the actual Equifax website. It shows the average debt for different age groups. There's also one on the news release with respect to different cities and different provinces. But I wanted to show you this because pretty much across the board, with the exception of those between the ages of 26 and 35, average debt has gone down over the last year. Now, for those of you who are 26 to 35, this is millennials. Watch that credit card debt, because your debt is actually increasing compared to every other age category. But that's a good sign that the average amount of debt is going down pretty much across the country. And not only that, the delinquency rates are super low on debt. And we're seeing, again, those delinquency rates. The delinquency rates are down pretty substantially across the board. But again, that 26 to 35-year-old age range has the worst track record when it comes to delinquencies. So if you're in that 26 to 35-year-old range, let this be a message and a clear message to you to be careful. Watch the debt, watch the credit cards, watch the new mortgages. Yes, it makes sense that you are going into a little bit more debt because you're at that time of life where that makes a little bit of sense. However, Make sure you're only taking on debt that you can afford to pay, because we're seeing the number of delinquencies in that age group go up pretty considerably. So what does this all mean for you guys? What does this all mean for the people watching this video? Well, what it means is that we're obviously taking on new mortgages because interest rates are lower and housing prices have increased. But Canadians, as a general rule, as agreed upon by Stats Canada, are generally doing better with respect to non-mortgage debt, and that's a good thing. But as things get better, as the economy opens back up, as GDP picks up, hopefully it will, because this last quarter wasn't a very good quarter, a very good month for GDP. As things get better, be very, very careful about taking on new debt. Don't let those spending habits that you've managed to somehow make disappear during the pandemic come back like they were previously. That means be more considerate about where you're going out to eat, how often you're going out to eat, the things you're spending money on, and so on and so forth. And if you can do that, this pandemic had this major effect with respect to habit changes on people's personal finances. And if you can just come out of this and manage to keep your spending levels down and your debt levels down, you're going to be very, very, very well off for the next 10, 15, 20 years. But it's only if you took that pandemic as the indication that you needed to change your habits. So if you found this video useful, do me that favor, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. Please hit that like button so more people like you can see this video. And don't forget about that race to 25,000 subscribers. I sincerely hope that you, yes, you, the person who watched to the very end of this video, I hope you're the winner. I hope you get to take that $5,000, pay down your debt, do what you want with it. And I sincerely hope, even if you aren't the winner, I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.